an elderly woman, nearly stopped breathing on the plane, and everyone froze, unsure what to do. Flight 724 from Denver to Boston had just reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The sky was clear, sunlight pouring through the cabin windows. Passengers were dozing off, reading quietly or munching on snacks. In row 18, an elderly woman named Louise, wearing a gray sweater and a light blue wool scarf, placed her hand on her chest. She gave a soft cough, just once. Her husband, seated beside her, turned with concern and asked if she was all right. Louise nodded faintly, but 5 seconds later, the coughing intensified. She hunched forward, her eyes widened, and her body stiffened. Her voice caught in her throat, struggling for air. Her hands trembled violently now. A passing flight attendant immediately stopped, her face turning tense. "Ma'am, are you okay?" she asked, crouching quickly. Louise didn't respond, only a vacant stare and shallow, rattling breaths. Passengers nearby began to turn their heads. Some stood, others leaned into the aisle for a better look. A man offered a bottle of water, but Louise couldn't even lift her hand. The attendant pressed the intercom button, calling for medical help. Louise's husband began to panic, calling her name, lightly slapping her cheeks. The cabin buzzed with anxiety. Someone shouted, asking if there was a doctor on board. A few passengers started recording. Others just sat frozen, unsure how to react. But from the last row of the plane, by the window, an old man no one had noticed since the flight began slowly unfastened his seatbelt. He rose quietly, reached under his seat, and pulled out a small, worn bag. His eyes locked onto the commotion ahead. His name was Hank. His jacket was faded, his shoes scuffed and old. No one knew him. No one called for him. But he stepped into the aisle with purpose, walking slowly toward row 18. And from the way he moved, from the way his gaze never wavered, it was clear he knew something the rest of them didn't. He didn't walk like an old man, not with hesitation, not with fear. He moved with quiet precision, measured, steady, as if every step was rehearsed. As he approached the middle rows, passengers instinctively moved aside. They didn't know who he was, but something about the way he carried himself made them pause. Hank stopped a few feet from Louise. Her breathing was shallow now, barely there. Her lips had turned pale, and her husband was weeping quietly, clutching her hand. The flight attendant blocked Hank with one hand. "Sir, please return to your seat. We're trying to—" "I know what this is," Hank said, voice low but firm. The flight attendant blinked. "Are you a doctor?" "No." "Then I can't let you." "I've seen this before. In the desert. In a tent with no light. She's going into respiratory arrest. If we wait for landing, she won't make it." The attendant hesitated. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that the plane was diverting to the nearest airport. Passengers murmured, some standing to look. A few began filming from their seats. But Hank wasn't waiting. He reached into his worn bag, pulling out a small metal tin and a tangle of tubing made from a plastic bottle and rubber bands. It didn't look like much, but to Hank, it was everything. Back in Afghanistan, he'd made that very setup with nothing but a knife, an empty hydration pack, and a pen tube. He had saved a young corporal on the edge of death. And now, that memory came rushing back. Every movement, every improvised step, every desperate second. He knelt beside Louise. "Ma'am," he whispered, even though she couldn't hear him. "Sir, I can't allow this." The flight attendant tried again, her voice faltering. But Hank looked up at her, not angry, not proud. Just steady. "You can stop me, or you can let me try to save her." There was a moment, just 2 seconds, when no one spoke. And in those 2 seconds, Louise exhaled a long, silent gasp, and her body went limp. Her husband screamed, and the flight attendant stepped back. Hank opened the tin. His hands shook, not with fear, but with memory. As Hank unwrapped the cloth inside the tin, his fingers brushed against each object like they were old friends, fragments of the past stitched together by trauma and necessity. A piece of flexible tubing, a sterilized safety pin, a thin plastic straw cut at an angle, and a military-issue surgical blade dulled by time, but still sharp enough for one last use. His eyes didn't see the plane anymore. He saw a dusty field hospital near Kandahar. No electricity, no medics, just screaming, blood, and a corporal, barely 20, gasping just like this woman now. He had to improvise then. He had to be precise. He had to be calm. And now, again, Louise's head lolled to one side. Her chest barely moved. Her pulse was faint. Her skin had gone gray. Her husband sobbed, begging anyone to help. A passenger in business, a tire stepped forward. "I think we should wait for the paramedics," he said nervously. "She's going to die before we land," Hank replied without turning. The man hesitated, then stepped back. Hank placed a straw into the tubing, fastened one end with gauze, and looked toward the woman's throat. There was a tiny indentation below the Adam's apple. He pressed gently. Then again, no airflow. His hand shook harder now, but not from uncertainty, from the weight of what he was about to do. A desperate technique. One last resort. A memory he had buried for years. The flight attendant hovered nearby. "Is she?" "She's gone if I don't act," Hank said flatly. He looked up. 1 second. 2. Then sliced. Gasps erupted around him. A child whimpered. Someone dropped their phone. But Hank didn't look away. He inserted the straw tube combination into the incision. Small, exact, clean. He blew once. Twice. Then he waited. And waited. The longest 10 seconds of his life. And then, a twitch. A shudder. A faint sucking sound from the woman's throat. Her chest lifted, just slightly. Then again, a cough sputtered up through the makeshift airway. Her eyes fluttered open. Louise was breathing, weak, ragged breaths, but real. Her husband dropped to his knees, gripping her hand like it was his lifeline. But not everyone saw it that way. "Sir, step back now." A second flight attendant rushed in, eyes wide at the sight of blood, and the improvised device lodged in Louise's throat. A passenger shouted, "He just cut her! That's insane." Another began yelling into their phone, live streaming the scene. Some guy stabbed a lady on the plane. I think he's dangerous." The cabin turned volatile. Hank didn't flinch. He sat beside Louise, his hand stained red but motionless now, focused calm, as if still in a war zone. He had seen chaos. He had seen blood turn to blame in less than a heartbeat. A security officer, plain-clothed, seated in first class, rushed down the aisle, hand near his waistband. "Sir, stand up. Hands where I can see them." "I just saved her life," Hank replied, still seated. "She's breathing." "Put your hands in the air." The pilot's voice came overhead. "We are beginning our emergency descent. Medical assistance will be waiting upon arrival." The cabin trembled with turbulence. And still, Hank didn't move. He turned slowly to the officer, raised his hands, and said, "I have no weapons. Just this." He held up the blood-stained straw and tubing, shaking gently in the artificial cabin light. A few passengers began murmuring, this time not with fear but uncertainty. Someone whispered, "She was dead a minute ago. Now she's breathing." Louise coughed again. The husband cried harder, holding her trembling fingers. The mood in the cabin began to shift. Not fully, not yet, but something had changed. They searched his bag. It sat beneath his seat, unassuming, torn on one side, the fabric fraying from years of use. A faded name tag stitched on the inside read, simply, H. Madsen. Inside, they didn't find weapons. No syringes, no sedatives, no threatening items. Only strange, carefully packed tools. A roll of gauze, 2 modified plastic bottles with markings etched in pen, a rusty compass, an old metal spoon, flattened at one end, and a tattered green notebook filled with sketches and measurements in pencil. The officer flipped through the pages. Drawings of windpipe angles, emergency procedures, pressure point maps, dates scribbled in the corners, some over 20 years old. It wasn't a kit of harm. It was a kit of preparation. "I built it after I came home," Hank said quietly, still seated, wrists now bound loosely with plastic ties. "For what?" the officer asked. "For if this ever happened again." The flight crew didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't aggressive. He hadn't run, but he had cut someone open midair. The passengers remained conflicted. Some still whispered accusations. Others simply stared at Louise, now propped up, breathing shallow but steady. One young woman stood up from 3 rows back and said loudly, "I saw her go limp. He saved her." Another voice, softer, followed. "My sister died from this, what she had." No one acted. No one knew what to do. Then silence again. Tense, thick, until the intercom crackled once more. "This is the captain. We'll be on the ground in 11 minutes. Medical response is on standby." Everyone sat down, except for Hank. He stayed where he was, beside Louise, hands resting calmly in his lap, as if still guarding her life. And though he said nothing more, the notebook in his bag said everything. As the plane descended, the hum of the engines deepened, vibrating through the cabin walls. Seatbelts clicked. The "prepare for landing" lights blinked on. Louise was conscious but weak. Her breaths passed through the makeshift airway, raspy but consistent. The plastic tube, taped carefully to her neck, looked crude, but it worked. Hank sat silently beside her. His eyes didn't close. He kept watching her chest rise and fall, timing each breath, noting the rhythm, just like he used to on the battlefield. The cabin crew stayed on edge. The security officer remained nearby, but no one dared to move Hank anymore. Passengers whispered. One by one, the tide of public opinion inside the cabin shifted. Why would he carry something like that if he wasn't trying to help? Did you see how steady his hands were? He looked like he'd done it before. The husband clutched his wife's hand with both of his. His voice trembled as he spoke to Hank. I don't know your name," he said. "Hank," the old man replied, eyes still on Louise. "You saved her." Hank nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "I didn't save anyone," he said. "I just remembered how not to lose someone." The husband looked confused, but didn't ask. He could see the weight in Hank's eyes. Decades of silence behind a single sentence. The plane hit turbulence again. A rough jolt. Louise stirred, coughing weakly. Her husband panicked. But Hank placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "It's all right." That's her body adjusting. "How do you know?" "Because I've seen worse." Another jolt. The plane banked slightly left. Flight attendants moved to check the aisles again. But no one interrupted the 3 figures in the middle row. Louise, her husband, and the man who wasn't supposed to be a hero, but had become one anyway. The descent felt longer than it should have. The world outside the windows had turned dusky orange, the sun dipping low across a skyline blurred by distance. Inside, time stretched thin. Louise's faint breaths continued, wet, shallow but steady. The tube Hank inserted shifted with every inhale. A drop of blood traced her neckline, but she was alive. Everyone around her stayed quiet. Phones lowered. Cameras stopped recording. The man who had once been accused of stabbing a passenger now sat in silence, watching life return to someone who, just minutes ago, had been slipping away. A child in row 20 broke the silence. "Mom, is she going to be okay?" The mother pulled him close, whispering something he couldn't hear. Then, slowly, one by one, people began to clap. Not loudly, not in celebration, but in respect, for something they hadn't expected to witness, and someone they had nearly misunderstood. The plainclothes officer, still standing nearby, looked at Hank again, this time differently, not with suspicion, but curiosity. "You ever do something like this before?" he asked under his breath. Hank didn't look away from Louise. "Twice," he replied. "Where?" Hank didn't answer. But the scar on his forearm and the tattoo on his wrist, the faded eagle with a torn ribbon beneath it, told the officer enough. The captain made his final announcement. "We'll be landing in 5 minutes. Emergency teams are waiting at gate 14. The man seated behind Hank leaned forward and whispered, "Thank you. Even if they don't say it, I will." But Hank didn't reply. He just kept watching Louise breathe. In and out, In and out, because until those lungs stopped, he wasn't done yet. The plane touched down hard. Wheels screeched against the runway. A brief shudder coursing through the fuselage. Gasps escaped some lips, but no one screamed. Everyone was too focused on what had just happened, what they had just witnessed. As the aircraft taxied slowly toward the emergency gate, red and blue lights flashed outside. An ambulance was already waiting. 2 paramedics stood poised near the jet bridge, gurney ready, oxygen tanks prepped. The cabin door opened. A blast of cool air rushed in. Flight attendants instructed passengers to remain seated. Paramedics entered swiftly, moving through the aisle with trained urgency. When they reached Louise, their confident pace slowed. They stared at the tube, at the blood, at the crude, but working setup. The lead paramedic looked up at Hank. "Who did this?" he asked. "I did," Hank said, standing now for the first time in over 20 minutes. The paramedic blinked. His partner examined the airway. "Is that from a straw?" Hank nodded once. "It worked." The paramedic checked Louise's pulse, then looked Hank in the eye. "You stabilized her. This could have gone very differently." "It has," Hank replied softly. "Before." Louise was carefully transferred to the gurney, oxygen mask secured. Her husband kissed her forehead, then turned to Hank and gripped his hand tight. "I owe you everything," he said, barely audible. "You owe her your love," Hank replied. "That's enough." The paramedics began to roll the gurney down the aisle. Passengers moved out of the way in complete silence. Heads turned, eyes followed, and when the couple disappeared through the aircraft door, everyone looked at Hank. But by the time they did, his seat was empty. His bag was gone. Only the folded green notebook sat quietly on seat 27F. On top of it, a napkin for words written in pen. "Don't thank me. Just act." The emergency team wheeled Louise out of sight. Her husband followed, head low, fingers still trembling from the weight of what had nearly been lost. Inside the cabin, no one moved. The passengers sat in stunned silence, as if the air around them hadn't quite settled. The murmurs had faded. The accusations had vanished. But Hank was nowhere to be found. The flight crew searched for him. The security officer checked the rear lavatories. Ground control was notified, but by the time the search began in earnest, he had already slipped out. No confrontation. No demand for thanks. No flash of ego. Just a quiet exit. An airline representative reviewed footage from the gate cameras. They caught a glimpse of him, Hank, stepping down the jet bridge, walking slowly with a slight limp, blending into the crowd. No uniform, no name badge, just an old man with a worn bag over his shoulder and a face hardened by time. He disappeared into the terminal like a ghost. But something lingered. The crew found his green notebook. Inside were diagrams, field notes, timestamps from old missions. Each page showed something different. How to make an airway from a plastic bottle. How to treat burns with just salt water and gauze. How to restart a stopped heart with pressure and timing. And on the very last page, a list of names. Some crossed out, some not. At the top, people I still remember. Hank's name was never announced over the speaker. No press release was issued. No headlines were written yet. But among the passengers on Flight 724, his name would never be forgotten. Because once at 35,000 feet, when the world stood still in fear, one forgotten man quietly saved a life and walked away without saying a word. 2 days later, the story made the news. A passenger had posted a video, not of the moment Hank inserted the tube, but of the aftermath, the frail woman breathing again, the husband weeping, the improvised kit, and the man in the background, silent, unnoticed, wiping his hands on a cloth before quietly returning to his seat. The clip went viral. People began asking, who was he? Someone recognized a tattoo from the blurry footage, a faded eagle over a torn ribbon, a veteran's insignia, obsolete but unmistakable. His name surfaced, Harold Madsen, a former combat medic, dishonorably discharged after disobeying orders in a failed mission 15 years ago. because he broke protocol to save civilians. They had survived, but he was punished. He disappeared from records after that. No contact, no address, until Flight 724. Louise, now recovering steadily in the hospital, had only one request: to thank him, to see him. But no one knew where he'd gone. The airline tried reaching out to veteran organizations. A few leads surfaced, all cold, until a nurse from a local shelter spoke up. He sometimes sleeps here, doesn't talk much, carries a little green book. By the time reporters arrived, he was gone again, but he'd left something behind. A note on the bulletin board, taped between flyers for canned food drives and coat donations. It read, "Saving lives shouldn't be a story. Forget the man. Remember the lesson." And below that, one line barely legible. "Her name goes in the book." That night, across the country, veteran support lines lit up. People asked how they could help. Donations poured into shelters. And a quiet man with trembling hands and battlefield memories had reminded the world what courage looked like. Not in uniform, not with medals, but with action. When no one else knew what to do,